Hi, and welcome once again to The Booking Club with me, Jack Aldane. This is the podcast that brings you today's best authors and commentators from a table at their favourite places to eat and drink. And on this episode, it is my great pleasure to introduce John Yorke, the author of Into the Woods, and now a new title, Trip to the Moon, Understanding the True Power of Story. If you hadn't heard of John Yorke before catching the Booking Club's live show at the Battle of Ideas Festival last year, I hope you did yourself the favour of finding out a little bit more about him. If you're a British listener in particular, you'll certainly have heard and seen an awful lot of his work over the years. John Yorke is the man who commissioned the TV drama Waterloo Road. He turned the BBC Radio 4 serialisation of G.K. Chesterton's Father Brown books into the hit TV detective show starring Mark Williams. He developed and, with some serious graft I imagine, redeveloped the original script for Life on Mars. After it was rejected by Channel 4 and later taken up by the BBC, Life on Mars is now a bona fide classic. He was the brain behind the script of some of the most iconic episodes of EastEnders back in the 2000s. One such episode, a finale remembered as the cliffhanger Who Shot Phil, aired in 2001. It attracted 20 million UK viewers. The population of the UK in 2001 was around 59 million. Let that sink in. Other TV shows and radio shows John has either commissioned or produced include Wolf Hall, Shameless, Spooks, The Wine Show, and that evergreen staple of BBC radio programming, The Archers. John, we're spoilt to have you twice on the Booking Club. Thank you for joining me once again.
A pleasure. Thank you for having me.
I should start off by confessing that the restaurant we're sat in, the Fig and Walnuts in Bloomsbury, is not your choice of restaurant. It is, in fact, mine, and reasons for this may become clearer as time goes on. Watch this space. But you were telling me about how difficult it has become to put your finger on the restaurant you most like to dine out at, because you don't dine out that much these days, even though as a script editor, you had plenty of occasion to, I imagine, in the past.
Oh, you know what? My early career, I mean, for the shows you mentioned, most of them were either formed in pubs or restaurants, to be honest. You know, but I am the proud owner of an 8-year-old child, and I'm a single dad. So that combination means it's almost impossible for me to really eat out very much at all. So I love cooking, so I'll cook at home.
What do you tend to cook at home?
Well, again, it's limited by my child's taste to an extent, so there's a lot of pasta going on. But when there wasn't pasta, I'd sort of work my way through anything, really. I just was always experimenting, always learning. I'd lived opposite this fantastic row of shops, which had a wonderful butcher, a wonderful fishmonger, and a wonderful greengrocer all in a row. So I never went to a supermarket. I just crossed the road, and they had this amazing fresh ingredients every day. So you just look and go, oh, I'll have the sea bass. And then what can I make with sea bass? And it was like, so, that's
lovely.
I inherited that from my mum. You know, I spent my first early years of my life just watching her cooking, basically, and sort of picked it up from there. I'm not as good as she was.
You weren't watching TV as a kid, obsessively?
Well, yeah, there was less on. Yeah, TV closed down like half the time. No, I watched some. I mean, I grew up watching shows, long forgotten shows like Z-Cars, which were huge in the 1960s. You know, and so I grew up in the early days of TV drama, basically, and so I learned a lot. I also lived in Barnes, which was very close to where BBC Television Centre is, and there were probably 6 TV producers who lived in my road. So, and I played with their kids. I knew them all. And, the stars of BBC dramas would often be in my road going into people's houses because it was very small world in those.
Did that get the ball of your career rolling? That can't surely just be coincidental.
Well, I remember, there's 2 things. I mean, I remember being incredibly impressed because my best friend who lived opposite me, his dad produced Z-Cars, which in those days was a massive hit for BBC. It was like a soap, police soap. And I remember one night watching the 2 stars of the show going into his house he was having a drinks party, clearly, and then going into my house, turning on the telly and seeing them on the telly at the same time, and that kind of blew my mind.
Were you an inquisitive, outspoken child? Did you ask the parents of these friends to tell you about how they made?
Yeah, I was always I was fascinated by that. And also, my dad made amateur films. He was a psychiatrist by training, but he belonged to a 16mm film club. Because in those days, there were no iPhones. Obviously, it was hard work making a film. But he used to write and direct amateur films, so I sat on set with him, and that was full of people from the BBC wanting to make their own movies as well. So I was kind of surrounded by that, and I asked questions all the time. I was the clapper boy.
Wow.
You know.
So no wonder you ended up where you ended up.
Well, possibly, yeah. I never made the connection, probably, but I think it is. You're right. It's there. I never thought of it till now, to be honest. But yes. Oh, my God. I've reviewed my life.
Before your latest book, the book we're going to be talking about this evening, was published, A Trip to the Moon, you wrote a book called Into the Woods, which has been a touchstone for many a creative writing student ever since.
Thank you.
But naturally, a book like this that builds on a book of a similar theme raises the question, what did you want to say in this book that you felt Into the Woods maybe scratched the surface of?
So Into the Woods was the product of a training scheme I set up for writers called the BBC Writers Academy, which ran for many years at BBC, 15, 20 years, because we were desperate for new writers and we couldn't afford the really good ones. So you start by training new ones and you work your way like that. The book came out of a series of lectures, and then one student of mine who had worked for Penguin before he decided to be a TV writer. And he said to me one day after, he says, you should turn this into a book. And I kind of laughed and said, don't be silly. And he said, no, I'm serious. And so a couple of years later, I timidly handed him a first chapter. And he, without him even telling me, he sent it to Penguin. And Penguin read it and called me. And that became Into the Woods, which was really lovely, and a terrible story for those wanting stories of my struggle, because it was ridiculously easy and very unfair in all kinds of ways. But they were lovely, and so the book was kind of this is a culmination of those letters, which is like the course was based around understanding narrative structure. If you teach writers narrative structure, which they're instinctively aware of anyway, and you get them to practice it, it's amazing how quickly they flourish, and the success rate of that course is still, I think 80% of them are still working in the industry after 20 years, which is mind-boggling. But that's not me. It's just they learnt structure. So I wrote that, and I thought, that's it. I don't want to do that again. But I just kept making notes, and I became more and more fascinated with story outside of fiction. So I became really interested in political narrative, the stories you have to tell to achieve power. And then, of course, it just occurred to me that, there must be lessons in that for fiction. And so that was really the genesis of the new book. So the first book is about structure. This book is about story power. What is it that can get Ronald Reagan from, a failed actor to president of the United States in 12 years? How do you do that? What is it that means that the Labour Party in Britain have only been elected from opposition 4 times in their entire history, which is a shockingly bad record. So I was asking those questions, and the more I made notes about it, the more I think there's a book here, because it's actually, I rather glibly call them stories in the wild. And I think there's so much you can learn from a successful narrative that you can then pull back and apply to fiction as well. And
many of those questions that you raise, we're going to be asking on this episode. It sounds to me that where perhaps politicians might in the past have looked to prototypic storytelling as a way to inform how they tell stories, you've looked at it the other way around. You're looking at politics and saying, what can this teach narrative builders? Is this because politics is one of the most disruptive spheres in which storytelling makes its mark today? Or is it because you've just found yourself kind of more embroiled in politics, probably the way most of us have, than perhaps you would have liked?
I think it's a combination of both. We're surrounded by politics all the time. You can't escape it, and it's noisier than ever, and social media has just massively amplified that.
And fiction has arguably become more political.
I think that's absolutely right. So you cannot move without being swamped by politics every day. So partly it was an attempt to make sense of that. And then, I started it long before Trump emerged down his escalator. But of course, as he did, that became absolutely fascinating, because I remember going fairly quickly from, this is a joke, to, oh my God, I think he's going to win, because just the story he was telling was so simple and so clear, and so powerful to a lot of people. It felt like, I'm not sure you can fight that with rationality. The big question was, would it appeal to enough people? And the answer is, well, it appeals to just enough people. So it was partly that, but then I expanded. It's not just politics. I look at religion and cult and ideology, but I also do that thing which most screenwriting books don't do, which is look outside Western structure and look at non-archetypal structure.
So you foresaw that Trump moment in 2016, perhaps before people commonly understood what was going on.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to claim any great sage-like foresight, but it felt to me that what he was doing that no other character really was he was talking emotionally. He was triggering emotion. Every time he talked, he triggered rushes of dopamine or cortisol, and that's what you have to do to tell a powerful story. Basically, the more emotional a story is, the more you wash the sands of logic away and you believe whatever the demagogue or the storyteller is telling you. And he was so good at that and reducing incredibly complex ideas to some ridiculously simple. I mean, so for example, I can't remember when he first coined the phrase. I mean, in fact, he stole it from Reagan. But if I said to you, can you write a story in 4 words? If I gave that exercise to my students, they would really struggle. But, Make America Great Again is perfect. It's almost impossible to improve upon. You know who the protagonist is, you know who the antagonist is, you know who the goal is. But it's impossible to disagree with, and it's emotional because the implication is it's been taken away. And those four in combination give you a perfect story. And he just did that straight away. And then he did it even more brilliantly in a story in 3 words. Drain the Swamp fits exactly the same criteria, and it just has a visceral reaction. And I think anyone following politics reasonably closely was starting to realize that there was a growing backlash to globalization. And there were a lot of people. You saw this in the north of England, all those communities for years that have been loyal to the Labour Party, all of whom had lost their work. My father's dad was a steelworker. So I saw Rotherham change as the steelworks collapsed. You saw, this growing sense of loss of purpose, loss of dignity, loss of identity, and the Labour Party weren't talking to them anymore. So you saw in this country what happened in America as well, which is a whole tranche of disaffected people suddenly found a champion who was articulating what they felt, which is like, make this country great again, give me purpose. And however intellectually you can tackle that and say, well, it's not as simple as that, and which of course you can, that's not going to wash, because the emotion has already taken over. And the people who tap into that, Farage in this country, Trump obviously in America, and all around the world now. It's ubiquitous, even in Japan. It's everywhere.
Does Trump prove that you don't have to be particularly well read to be a good storyteller? He famously was interviewed, I think, on a TV slot back in the 80s, where he claimed to have read Tom Wolfe's Vanity of the Bonfires or something like that, and when pressed on the plot, he had nothing.
I don't think you need to read books. I think if you want to be a novelist or a playwright, it's really useful to read lots of novels and lots of plays. You really should.
But to coin a slogan, you just have to have a sense for emotion.
And I think, the other great master in this century, sort of after Roosevelt, who was extraordinary in his own way, was Ronald Reagan. Both he and Trump had the benefit, I think, of not being, not stupid, but not the brightest people in the world. And sometimes that's really helpful, because what you tend to do is you reduce the world to a binary. And of course, binary stories are the ones that travel. So, Make America Great Again is a really binary story. Someone's stolen it, we'll get it back. If you look at the slogan Hillary Clinton used in the same campaign against Trump, stronger together, there is no story there at all. It's terrible. It's extraordinary how so many well-paid operatives came up with something so bad. It doesn't tell a story. So basically you're putting multiplex blockbuster against Arthouse minnow, and that was the end of Hillary Clinton.
The place where politics and storytelling intersect most for most people is satire. But satirists have sort of had their legs cut off, really, haven't they, by the populist movement? Many satires now that we look back on over the last 25 years, I'm thinking particularly here of The Thick of It, just seems neutralised.
I think, like satire requires an enemy. And so who is the enemy? That's a problem because we're much more niche and fragmented than we were. So I think what happens is each tribe has their own satirist who they'll follow now on YouTube, or so any other kind of social media. So you don't get communal satire in the way The Simpsons would be a kinder example. And also what's been interesting with the left in particular is how, in my recent lifetime is watching how puritanical they've become, and I think that's another element of it. And I speak as a child of the left. When I was a youth, it's extraordinary. How much in the last 10 years, you can't say this, you can't say that. That's incorrect. You can only punch down. Blah blah blah. And all for ostensibly good reasons, but that kills satire. You couldn't even put on Beyond the Fringe now without being cancelled, I suspect. No. So, sad. So I think it's a combination of circumstances. It's interesting that the most successful comedian probably in the world at the moment is Ricky Gervais, who incidentally I knew when he was an unemployed loafer.
Really?
Yeah, and he hasn't changed a bit. He was like,
he's certainly employed now.
Well, yeah, he's wealthier. He'd buy a round, I hope now, because he certainly didn't then. But he, his target is becoming more and more. The woke left.
Well, the story of censorship is a convenient one whenever there's anything in your way as a businessman, it seems. Yeah.
Right, absolutely.
If TfL won't let you put up a billboard mocking the idea of suicide or alcoholism, you just turn to your fan base and you say, these people are trying to censor us.
Powerful story.
Very powerful story.
I remember, I was a teenager when the Sex Pistols were around and, banned. Immediately you could go out and buy it. It's great. It's great. I bought 3 copies of God Save the Queen, which is probably the reason it went to number 1.
Do you still have copies?
I do.
My God, they must be worth a pretty penny now.
I think Anarchy in the UK on the original EMI label is worth a little bit more because that's rarer. But now you're getting into my geeky vinyl collecting part.
Oh, well, listen, I'm a fan of punk rock. But let's go into some of the mechanics of storytelling.
Sure.
Particularly the 10 questions storytelling.
Oh, right, yeah. Okay, well, so the 10 questions, actually, it's sort of where this all began 20 years ago, 15 years ago. I've been working at Channel 4 Drama. I was running it, and I came back to the BBC. I was headhunted back, and I realised, we have a writing problem. I need to train writers. And so I went back to my office, and I sat down, and I wrote the 10 questions. And so the 10 questions are fundamentally they're for very basic archetypal storytelling, but they're a really good starting point when testing if an archetypal story is working. So it's whose story is it? Who is the protagonist? Who's the central character? Who's driving the story? The second question is what's their character flaw? What do they need? What's missing that they need to become complete? The third question is what's the inciting incident, which is what's the problem the character is going to face. In every story, Alice falls down a rabbit hole. So, that's the problem you have to deal with. What do they want? They want an answer to their problem. So the fourth question is, what do they want? What's their specific goal? So in Citizen Kane, it's going to find out what Rosebud means. Kane has died, find out what Rosebud means. So that's question 4. Question 5 is, what obstacles are in their way? Forces of antagonism that have to get bigger as they go along. Question 6, I think, is why should I care? So it's empathy. What is it about the protagonist that makes you care about them? Because the empathy is vital. Question 7 is what's at stake? Because is there jeopardy? And if not, why not? But there doesn't have to be jeopardy, but jeopardy always makes the story more exciting, so it's always a good thing to check, do I need that there? Question 8 is, what do they learn? And the answer is always, they learn the thing that will heal their character flaw. So if you could look at, you take any Pixar film, in that imperial stage of Pixar films, the character flaw with Buzz Lightyear or Marlin, Nemo's dad, or Lightning McQueen, is they're all selfish. And so what they're going to learn is to be selfless. They're going to learn to collaborate. So question 8 is what do they learn? Question 9 is how and why do they learn that? Yeah, there's normally a scene, a crisis point in a story where they're confronted with the lesson that will give them their answer. And then question 10, of course, is how does it end? Because everything is about the ending, so if you do that as a checklist, you can immediately tell if your story has all the ingredients it needs. So I use it sometimes now when I'm making stories, but mostly, I give it to people whose stories aren't working and say, run through that. If you can't answer any of those, that's your problem.
Is it fair to say then that the last question, how does it end, can be what you want it to be so long as question 9 is answered, i.e. the resolution actually comes before the ending?
Yes and no. I mean, an ending is really sown at the beginning of the story. Often if an ending doesn't work, it's because you've got a problem in the first act. Because if you think about it, all a story really is a question. That's the inciting incident, and an answer. That's the rest of the story. So, the big test is the question I set up at the beginning being completely answered? And that's a saying. But of course, there are the ways of doing that. Normally, the classic Greek way is to do it with a twist. So it's answered, but in a way that is both surprising, makes you go, oh my God, but then inevitable. You go, oh, of course. And that combination, goes all the way back to Antigone, the classic twists you see in The Sixth Sense or the others, those wonderful twists. That's classic Greek dramaturgy.
I just looked at the menu earlier. I think I know what I'd like to order. It's from the specials menu. It's called Iskender kebab. That's a chicken, lamb, and a dana sheesh laid over a bed of bread and garlic yogurts, topped with tomato sauce, chili butter, and salad.
So I'm going to have a special as well. I'm going to have the Ali Nazik, which it says here is a chicken and lamb sheesh over char-grilled aubergines with garlic, tahini, yogurt topped with chili butter and salad.
Perfect.
Amazing.
Reading this book, your mind is blown a lot. There's one page where you have a grid that breaks down the structure of the Star Wars trilogy and lays it out like an origami map. And you can see then, without giving anything away, how it's also simple. Of course, not simple to conceive, not simple to write, but why it works and how it works is for you to explain to me now. You do in the book, but to the audience, we'd like to know.
There's a lot there. I mean, the thing you're talking about is it goes by the name of chiasmus. And what the Star Wars trilogy and the other 3 films as well in the main sextet are they form a perfect chiasm, which means if you fold them in half, you'll find that they mirror each other at every stage. And that tells you something about archetypal storytelling.
Yeah, when I learned about chiasmus in the book, I thought that I must have a special weakness for it, but then I realized as I read on that we all do.
That's what's so fascinating. I mean, I think with George Lucas, given the interviews he's done about it, it's partly conscious, I think. But what's bizarre is if you do the same thing with the Harry Potter novels, all of them, you fold them in half, bang in the middle is obviously where Voldemort arises for the first time. It's a chiasm. It's ridiculously unnerving how much it mirrors there. There's something about the storytelling mechanism, the way we make sense of the world, that looks for parallels and opposites. And we do some. Now that can sound incredibly complex, but if you reduce it to a really simple story like The Gruffalo, and if you're familiar with The Gruffalo, children's story by Julia Donaldson, it's the most popular kids story in Britain, and I think in a huge places around the world. It's a story is really simple. Is a mouse wants a nut. And so he goes on a journey into the forest and he meets a malevolent owl and a malevolent fox and a malevolent snake. And then bang in the middle of the story, right where Voldemort should be, he meets the Gruffalo. And Gruffalo is the monster in the heart of the forest. And he needs to learn to tame that monster or the monster's going to kill him. And so he learns to tame that monster on the way back, encountering the snake, the owl and the fox in reverse order. And because he manages to do that, he then gets the nut and his journey is complete. and it's a perfect story, and it's perfectly symmetrical, and it tells you everything about the nature of story structure, which is we crave order, we crave change, plus we love the central character that takes us on a journey into the heart of a story where the meaning, which is his empowerment, is found. It's the monster he has to tame. And then the second part of the story is how he tames that monster and brings it home and gets the nut and wins.
Audiences demand order, for order is God. That was a line in the book that I particularly enjoyed.
It's rather portentous, isn't it?
But it made me wonder, is a lot of Western storytelling based on the parables of the Bible? And are all heroes essentially Jesus Christ?
Oh, that's a very interesting question. I don't think they're based on the parables. I think the parables are an example of the human desire to make sense of the world. I mean, they're a classic example, like they're stories that contain a lesson. But you see those in every culture around the world. It's not just the Bible. You'll see that in Japanese Zen stories would be a classic example. There's an instruction, because stories fundamentally do contain a lesson. Sometimes the lesson may be oblique and intangible, but it's still there. And so what's interesting, however, is the most powerful stories in the world are the ones that involve the triumph over death. You look at any story anywhere in the world, it's always that, the big story is that. And of course that is fundamentally biblical. It's, religion is there to bring us to terms with the idea of death, that we will live on. And religions throughout the world are their devices to make us, accept, or deal with the terror of the fact that we might be meaningless and just inert carbon units that have no meaning anymore. And so, from Star Wars to Harry Potter to Jack Reacher to the Lord of the Rings, or every single story is the Bible story, in the sense that Jesus dies and is reborn and then ascends. And in fact, if you read Harry Potter, the biblical parallels are absurd. There's so many of them. It's almost like she's just retelling, Harry is Jesus.
Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, the creators of Superman, explicitly wanted to create a Christ-like figure. There was a remake just last year.
Yeah, a good remake, actually.
Yeah, I thought so too. Not an easy thing to do after so many decades of having the same character rehashed. Why is it so compelling, that character of Superman?
Well, the story of its foundation is really fascinating. So they're children of Jewish immigrants. And so they fled, the encroaching Nazism in Europe, and they find themselves in America, and they're reading about Hitler and his rise, and they're becoming more and more disturbed, and they're trying to make their way as comic book writers and artists as well. And out of that, they're looking for a story that they think will have resonance. And one of them, I think it's Siegel, might have been Joe Shuster, one night just is lying in bed worrying about this, and then says, wouldn't it be great if you could fly? And out of that emerges, what frankly is an almost direct tale, retelling of the Moses story. So Superman, basically is the Moses for the modern age. Moses arrives to us in a basket of bulrushes abandoned by his parents who are being killed. It's exactly the same with Superman, and the story follows those parallels. And the way I describe it in the book, it's not my idea, it's someone else's idea who I do credit, but I can't remember now. Is Superman was a reaction formation. Reaction formation is an ego defense mechanism where you create an opposite force to the thing that terrifies you the most. And an awful lot of stories come out of that.
An awful lot of superheroes in particular, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Superheroes are all reaction formation. And it's interesting how many of those superheroes, the ones that dominate our culture, were created by Jewish refugees. Just a huge amount of them. And so it's really, really that, that's the story. It's very biblical, but of course, that gets forgotten really quickly. I didn't know that, until I started researching the book. And I go, oh my God, of course.
And so when it came to last year's launch of the new Superman, what did you think worked so well?
I was 14 or 15 when the Richard Donner first Superman came out with Christopher Reeve. And I remember going to cinema and just being utterly bewitched by just, oh my God, a man can fly. That was the poster, you'll believe a man could fly. And Christopher Reeve was fantastic, and Margot Kidder. I mean, the whole cast, it was just glorious. And so, all the Superman remakes since then had sort of just felt just a bit grim and a bit joyless. But I think what was interesting was he went back to the Richard Donner film, and he realized, that's the tone you want. You can't just be grim. Superman is charming and funny and innocent in many ways. His innocence is part of his power. And so he just recaptured that and made it funny and charming and endearing, and then found someone, almost as good as Christopher Reeve to play him. And David Corenswet is fantastic in it.
He is.
He was told to cut out at one point where Superman, in the middle of all this mayhem, where thousands of people are dying and cities being destroyed, he sees a squirrel in peril and he saves the squirrel. And of course, because that's Superman, it's such a lovely, brilliant moment of character. Of course he'd save the squirrel, and it's funny and it's endearing. And I took my then 8-year-old boy with me, and he was a bit scared through some of it, but that's the bit where he'd go, this is great. And so it's that. I think he captured that idea of childhood and what it means to a child. And Superman will protect you when you're scared. It's like religion. It's a very religious thing, isn't it?
Since we're on the subject of superheroes, it's very easy for you and I, two blokes, to sit across the table and reminisce and talk about the beauty and significance and power of the male superhero. The female superhero, of course, is hinted at the end of the last Superman movie, but female superheroes have had a much harder time really taking off, terrible pun. Why, do you think?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, it's not something I've given a huge amount of thought to before, but clearly male superheroes are archetypal male fantasies because they're fantasies largely of power and domination, and I suspect that again, I'm being very careful about stereotyping here. They're not the fantasies that a large majority of women have. Probably more mature in the way they look at things, or they dream of different things. And it's about who every story at one level is, who do you want to be? Who do you most want to be? And that dictates the success or failure of a story.
It's interesting, though, when you talked about the reaction formation. I mean, there are many, many ways in which an opposite force to the thing you most fear is just the sort of thing that I imagine so many female script writers, so many female creatives have conceived of, and probably because the industry has been quite resistant, haven't managed to get through.
It's interesting that, but if you look at, from the Bionic Woman to Supergirl, Superwoman, Wonder Woman, I mean, Wonder Woman was pretty good, but it was a very affectionate tribute to the Richard Donner film as well, wasn't it? So it's interesting, they just don't seem to sell in the same way, which suggests that there is no innate desire amongst enough of the female population to want to be those people in a fantasy.
Well, we've talked a lot about Western structures, but after we've eaten, I can see the food's arriving now. We'll talk about narrative structures that sit outside the Western canon. Listener, let me take a moment to tell you about a book club you're going to want to join. It's called the Battle Book Club. It was set up by the Academy of Ideas last year to mark the 20th anniversary of the Academy's Battle of Ideas Festival. Now, there are, of course, lots of book clubs you could be joining, both online and offline, but few see literature as the front line of free thought and invigorating debate. That's where the Battle Book Club stands out. It makes reading great works of fiction the process by which we can hope to overcome polarization in a time of rapid social and political change. Great novels are full of existential provocations, and whether they are recognized for it or not, they are instrumental to our understanding of politics and political ideology. The best rouse uncomfortable emotions and raise challenging questions, but they also leave us feeling wiser. Most book clubs only allow people to feel heard. That's why, if you've listened to this podcast for a while, you'll want to join the Battle Book Club. Soon the Battle Book Club and the Booking Club will be joining forces in a new series of online debates. Consider yourself hereby invited. You can discover the Battle Book Club's work at academyofideas.org.uk and follow its progress on Instagram. That's at Acad of Ideas, ACAD of Ideas. And now, back to the podcast. So how did you find Jermaine, John?
Well, I'm stuffed. Absolutely delicious. Yeah, it was an adventure.
They have deceptively small plates here, don't they?
Oh, my God, yeah.
Pretty small, but they pile them high.
Yeah, I wanted to take the rest home in a doggy bag, to be honest, because I'm not going to finish
Not a bad idea. We were talking about Western story structures. We were talking about the Christ figure. We were talking about the role of religion. But one thing that you talk about is a lecture you gave in which a slight disagreement with a student led you to go away and think about whether or not your lectures revolved around the Occidental narrative. And it leads you to the art of Kisho Tenketsu.
Yeah.
A word which breaks down into, I think, 4 parts. One that originates in Chinese poetry and which has actually been applied very successfully to the video game medium.
Yeah.
Things like Super Mario. I saw a diagram of Kisho Tenketsu, which looked remarkably like a somersault.
Yeah.
But I really have to leave it to you now to explain this.
Yeah, so I mean, I've been lecturing for years, and audiences change over time, and their concerns and their priorities. Every generation of students is, like more concerned with one thing or another. But it was really striking, like 4 or 5 years ago, is the audience became much more nicely belligerent. No, it was absolutely, nice about it. But there was this one particular lecture I gave where at the end of it took questions, and there was one guy who was angry, and he just said, well, this is all Western, isn't it? This is just patriarchal Western imperialist bullshit,
Yeah.
Which is quite challenging. I said to him, well, okay, name the films you've seen that don't do this. And he couldn't, because it's very hard when you think about it to not find, the structure there. But that wasn't a good argument, because absence of evidence doesn't mean the argument is wrong. And I realised that actually, what I should have done was hold my head in shame and go away and study the subject in much more detail, which is what I then went off to do. So I spent a year just exploring. I mean, some of it I knew already. I just didn't realize I knew it, but exploring, storytelling around the world, and the one in the screenwriting world, there's one model that crops up again and again, which is is presented as the antithesis to the hero's journey. So the hero's journey is the classic, superhero narrative, but you see it in pretty much every film, from Hamlet to Sorry Baby. It's just there. It's a very Western way of telling stories. But what you get told about Kisho Tenketsu is that it's conflict-free narrative. And it's because, it arose from a culture that didn't prize thrusting, phallic, lightsaber wielding, heroes, in the same way. So you look at it and say, well, Kisho Tenketsu, what is it? So I went down, I tracked down a professor of Japanese literature and Asian literature, who was incredibly helpful. And we just went through it with her together. Basically, it's a 4-act structure, and there's 4 stages. Tora, the key, the show, the 10, the key, show, 10, and the su, ketsu, yeah. And the first stage is the introduction. The second stage is the rising action, the complications. The third stage is where it appears to differ, because it's a massive twist. Suddenly you go somewhere completely different. Makes no sense at all. And then the fourth stage is where everything is united. Okay. So it arises from a form of poetry, 4-line poetry, which is a bit like a limerick form or whatever, but where everything makes sense at the end. And over time, it developed into a form of storytelling that you can see in films like Spirited Away, a lot of Studio Ghibli films, or Parasite would be probably the most famous example of recent years. But as soon as you realize that, you notice, well, they're not conflict free. And even in the poetry isn't conflict free. What the poem does is transfer the conflict from the protagonist to the reader. And so you experience the conflict. If that doesn't make sense, dissonance. Conflict is dissonance. Therefore I need order. Oh, of course, the last line, which is of course identical to Greek peripeteia.
I think we need a good example here.
Okay, so if you want a sort of poetic version of it, you have the example. There's a poem I use in the book by the Japanese author Sanyo Rai. I hope I pronounced him correctly. So the first stage, the key is the daughters of the thread merchant in the Motomachi area of Osaka. So this is the exposition introducing the characters they are. The show. The eldest daughter is 16 and the younger one is 14. The 10 is the twist stage. The great lords from all fiefdoms conquer with bows and arrows. So that's, again, what's that got to do with it? Then you go to the ketsu. The daughters of the thread merchant conquer with their eyes. And that's the typical example of a Kishu Tenketsu form. Okay, so very simple, very clear. But if you transfer that to, quite a well-known Japanese story called The Licked Hand, it goes like this. There's the key, the intro stage. A young girl is home alone with only a pet dog for comfort. Then there's the show, the development stage. She hears on the news of an escaped conflict and becomes frightened. She's too scared to go to sleep without letting the dog lick her hand from beneath her bed. Then you have the twist. When she awakes, she discovers that her dog is dead and has been the entire night. Dissonance. Yeah, it doesn't make sense. And then finally, the ketsu. She finds the words, humans can lick too, written in blood on her floor.
So not conflict-free at all, really. As you say, transferring the conflict to the reader, but I'm grasping here. I'm trying to understand what the real distinction is. Is it the fatalism of these stories that distinguishes it from the Western structure?
I think it depends how you use it. I think, the big distinction is simply it's a distinction of form, which is the third stage, is a massive twist that originally makes no sense. And so you have to navigate that dissonance to reach the end. And I think the conclusion I come to, which is I think I looked all around the world at all the different story structures I could find, and they're differences in form. They're not differences in the underlying shape. You can still see the underlying 3-act story shape there, but each culture finds a different style to use that shape and tell it for its own ends. You see that in Japanese Zen stories. You see that in the Mahabharata, Indian epic form, or in other Japanese, Chinese stories like Journey to the West or Monkey, Water Margin. Those stories, they're actually terribly similar, but ostensibly they're different. And the way I talk about it in the book, I think I use the analogy of it's like, we all. Every culture has a flag and an anthem, and they're all that's universal, but every flag is different, and it's that fundamentally they're poets and traditions, but they use the other forms as well. And I think the professor of Japanese literature I spoke to, was actually much angrier about this than I was, and she's saying it's not different, it's just a form. And she said she finds this idea that the Japanese are somehow different and the Chinese are different or conflict-free. It's absurd, if you look at their history. It's as blood-soaked as any Western.
And there are plenty
story.
of Japanese superheroes. I'm thinking of One Punch Man. And, of course, the video game medium wouldn't work. Perfected and pioneered in Japan,
Yeah. So she found it quite racist.
Right, projecting a kind of a harmonious repose.
Yeah, so, she saw it as a kind of othering as well. It kind of like, back to Edward's side, that kind of argument of Orientalism,
Yeah, you mentioned this at the very beginning, the dopamine cortisol balance that you're trying to disrupt and manage with your audience. Is that ultimately what storytellers like yourself are trying to do? Are you trying, in a sense, to drug us with these hormones?
I think storytelling is, the best storytellings they work like a drug. It's actually dopamine and adrenaline, to be fair.
Yes.
I've simplified it as that.
Having watched Marty Supreme in cinema 3 times now, I loved it so much. I can testify.
And I think,
Storytellers are drug dealers.
Storytellers are drug dealers. And I think, what you're looking for is, is it, you want every scene, its priority should be to make it emotional. Because what you're doing is you're releasing a drug. I use the analogy with cigarette smoking. The only thing that makes you want the next cigarette is the last cigarette. Alan Carr's brilliant insight into smoking. But it's the same with story structure. Each scene releases a hormone that you immediately want more of. And, it's not dissimilar. It's identical, is it, to infinite scroll on a phone or a tablet. It's like that's what hooks us. You have to fight to put down a device. But it should be the same with story. And so the most powerful stories are the ones that just, eke out emotion continually. They doll it out to you and you're addicted. And again, watch Donald Trump. He feeds addicts. He's very good at it.
We're still living through an historic glut, it seems, of addictive long-form TV. But which show of the last 25 years do you think takes the crown as the most accomplished, most innovative? I'm forever telling people to go back to The Wire because I maintain that is where TV first shows us what we now subsequently look for in every TV show. But what do you think?
The Wire is clearly seminal in all kinds of ways because it's the novelization of television, and so it's really seismic. And much of it is brilliant. I can't help feeling slightly disappointed by the final season, where I think it all felt suddenly a bit rushed, which is such a shame. But that's a slightly churlish response for something that was clearly brilliant. I think the two things that have three things I always find myself going back to. One is ancient, which is Dennis Potter's The Singing Detective, which still seems to me the most extraordinary radical use of the TV medium that's ever existed. It's just quite bonkersly brilliant. And everything about it is perfect. I suspect some of it's dated and its language is probably a bit dated now, but in terms of conception, form, and the way it was executed, it's peerless. In more recent years, the thing that struck me the most is probably Michaela Cole's I May Destroy You, which is a really extraordinary piece of bravura writing, incredibly brave where it goes and fearless. And she said this thing which I try and pass on to all my students who makes them uncomfortable, but she said, write what scares you. And I think we live in a culture where a lot of stories are there to applaud us and tell us we've made the right decisions and we belong to the right tribe. What she does is the opposite of that. She takes the thing she most believes and she attacks it.
And what you most fear and what you most believe, am I to take it from that? Are the same?
Yeah, it's examine your beliefs. Pull them apart. Challenge them. Write the thing that no one else is brave enough to write. And she does that. I mean, I May Destroy You is a really brilliant example of that. So she's very high on my list. But the one I find myself going back to, which won't seem particularly radical or brave, but it just feels like a show where everything is perfect, would be the Scott Frank adaptation of The Queen's Gambit, which is just TV
fantastic.
At its best.
Fantastic
it's just
series,
remarkable.
Isn't it?
Casting brilliant, directing brilliant, script brilliant, dialogue brilliant. Everything about it is just wonderful, and it's better than the book.
John, we've only really scratched the surface of Trip to the Moon. That said, I would like us to end where we began, on the subject of politics. You must have seen Mark Carney's speech recently at Davos. It's made headlines in ways that political speeches haven't been able to in recent years. Tell us what you thought of it.
Yeah, it's very interesting because I think I was reading recently that the average speech in the House of Commons in the last 30 years, since the advent of television, really, has decreased in length and continually decreased in length. And now what you have is people going to the House of Commons to get a soundbite they can film to send on Twitter. And so you feel this glorious art of rhetoric is dying. So the first thing I thought when I heard Mark Carney was like, maybe it's not dead, because it feels like a dying art, which is catastrophic because it's the most wonderful and profound way of putting away putting information across. And he did something which everyone needed because they've been so shocked by Donald Trump and the crassness and the coarseness of his speaking. Yeah, he's a brilliant storyteller. He's a public speaker, not so much. Rhetoric is not his strong point. A series of brilliant sound bites is what he's really good at. So to see a perfectly crafted speech that followed all the rules of classical rhetoric as laid down by Cicero, but also lifted lifted a people, and gave them a point and something to look at, an enemy that was clearly defined, and a course of action to defeat that enemy was, an incredibly impressive piece of rhetoric, whether you agree with him or not. But it struck a chord that very few speeches have had in the last 15, 20 years. And thank God, someone needs to say, there's still nothing more powerful than a beautiful, well-crafted speech.
I would say wannabe political leaders with a modicum of virtue take note, but they haven't for the last 25 years. I don't know why they would start now.
Well, they have on the right. Now you're seeing it on the left with the Green Party here in the UK, who are very good at telling stories as well.
This is true. Yeah,
threat.
We can say the right, but really it's populists that are leading the charge of that.
It's simplistic answers to impossibly complex problems.
I asked this of all my guests, which literary figure would you take to dinner?
It would have to be Shakespeare.
Okay, why?
Because I don't know anything about him. And Paul Mescal hasn't convinced me that Shakespeare was a centrist dad, which seems to be the current take. I just want to know how someone, with a grammar school education can do that, because it's mind-boggling.
And finally, the best book you've read in the last 6 months?
Would be I Promessi Sposi, or The Betrothed by Alessandro Manzoni, which is an Italian novel which I'm told that every child in Italy has read. It's the central part of their culture. I didn't know it, and I had to read it for work, and I was, oh God, it's long, and it's 19th century, and it's just brilliant. It's an epic, but it's really funny. It's really savage. It tells you everything you've ever wanted to know about Italy, and it just leaves you. It talks about the plague. A plague is a big part of it. But when you're reading it, going like, oh my God, this is COVID he's talking about. The behavior we saw in COVID, he outlines, 100 years before. So it's an outstanding piece of work. And I give it to everyone partly because with all that, it's just what I think every great work of art should be, which is an explosion of pure joy.
John Yorke, congratulations once again on the publication of Trip to the Moon. I wonder, given this is a sequel to Into the Woods, whether this might be a trilogy we're about to see unfold. Maybe in the next 12 years we get the final installment. You keep us hanging, don't you?
I think Penguin would say we'll see how this does. But yes, there's always more.
Thank you very much for joining me.
Pleasure.